Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, your host, and in today's country profile episode, I want to welcome you to part 1 of 2 on the Czech Republic, otherwise known as Czechia, otherwise known as Bohemia and Moravia if you want to get historical. Now, while originally I was just going to do a single episode on the Czech Republic, the more I thought about it, I realized there's just simply too much to talk about. The fact of the matter is that the people who live in the Czech Republic invented the now world-renowned style of Pilsner beer, which is a type of lager. And on top of that, the Czech Republic just has a very prolific brewing history in general. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about Pilsner Urquell, the brewery that started it all, along with the Havlíčkův Hrad brewery, which produces the Rebel brand of beer. So when talking about the Czech Republic, it's first important to note that the Czechs drink more beer per capita than any other group of people in the world. So as you can imagine, they take their beer and their beer culture very seriously. And arguably the most well-known Czech brewery outside of Europe certainly, and maybe even in Europe outside of the Czech Republic, is Pilsner Urquell. Now, whenever talking about industries and sort of industry firsts, there's always a lot of the first so-and-so, or the first person to do X or Y or Z or whatnot. But when talking about beer, the concept of a Pilsner or a Pilsner-style lager is so ubiquitous, it's almost hard to imagine the modern world without this being the primary alcoholic beverage of choice of hundreds of millions, I mean, let's be honest, billions of people. And as far as we are aware, from all historical evidence available, the brewery of Pilsner Urquell invented the modern-day Pilsner-style lager. Now, to be clear, Pilsner Urquell did not invent the lager. The lager is a sort of broader category of beer, of which a Pilsner is a style. And lagers had been around since before the mid-19th century, and those had mostly been pioneered by people in Germany. But, to quickly clarify, a Pilsner is going to be a sort of pale-colored, hoppier version of a lager, at least compared to the lagers that had existed previously in history. And so while Pilsners are not the only style of lager out there, they are by far the most common style of lager. And by some estimates, something like 90% or more of all beer produced on planet Earth by volume is Pilsner-style lager, which, if you're wondering who do we thank for the beer style that ended up conquering planet Earth, you can thank the guys at Pilsner Urquell. Or not, you know, if you're a big fan of IPAs or stouts or porters and Hefeweizens and whatnot. So Pilsner Urquell was founded in 1839 with production of the beer not starting actually until 1842, interestingly. And for a style of beer that ended up conquering the globe, I would say that's a pretty recent start date in the scheme of things. Now, I would be remiss to mention the fact that while all of this was happening in what is today the Czech Republic, the land at the time was called Bohemia, and it was part of the Austrian, soon to be Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what this meant was that throughout Bohemia, or at least in certain pockets of it, there were reasonably large populations of who else but Germans. And these German communities had been living in certain areas of Bohemia since really the Middle Ages in many cases, though they were overwhelmingly concentrated in really towns and cities. And what this means is that there's something of almost a contentious issue over who kind of created the Pilsner, right? Is it the Czechs or is it the Germans, since both of them were sort of living there at the same time? And it can get kind of muddy if you sort of delve into who's the first person doing things. Though the answer might actually be, well, both of them. Because if we look at the history of Pilsner Urquell, that is exactly what happened. The brewery was started by both Czech and German citizens living in the same town together. A town which the Germans called Pilsen. And if you couldn't guess, Pilsen is where we get the word Pilsner, so a beer from the town of Pilsen. And this name, Pilsen, was based on the Czech name of the town, which was Plzeňa. I'm sorry, Czech viewers, your language is basically impossible for any non-Slavic people to pronounce correctly, but I'm sure you knew that by this point. Though, now that I think about it, I actually know a couple of Czech guys, and you know, maybe I can check in with them on how to pronounce this correctly. Okay, that is my one pun for the episode. Moving on. To talk about the other word in the name Pilsner Urquell, we've got this word Urquell. And Ur is also sort of a German prefix which means sort of the first, or kind of old, but in sort of an ancient way, like the first thing to have ever, you know, come about. You get Ur a lot in sort of archaeology, ancient linguistics, that sort of thing. So Pilsner Urquell, or Pilsner Urquell, basically means the original source at Pilsen, or the first of Pilsen. Now, while the name is German and the first brewmaster was German, a guy called Josef Kroll, there was also a lot of Czech influence in this operation as it got going. As I said, there weren't just Czech citizens involved in getting everything going, but the language of business that was used seems to have been a mix of Czech and German, or rather, Czech and German were basically used bilingually by the people at the brewery as things were moving along. Now, if you couldn't guess from this style of beer and how popular it has become worldwide, pretty much almost as soon as the brewery started making this Pilsner style lager, competitors sprang up all over the place in the late 40s, really 1850s and 1860s. So by about 1860 or so, it was pretty much off to the races for brewers throughout Europe. This was also helped a lot by the fact that you had railroads, which were rapidly expanding in sort of their, their mileage, and this allowed for the transport of more sort of standardized versions of beer. It's kind of incredible, actually, if you look at the number of what are today viewed as pretty major flagship Pilsner style lagers that got started between about kind of 1860 and sort of 1910. And you had Czech competitors like Gambrinus starting in the 1860s, you had Moretti in Italy in 1860, Heineken and Beck's both got started in 1873, American Budweiser in 1876, Carlsberg launched its Pilsner style lager in 1904, you get the idea. But throughout all of this, what's very interesting is that Pilsner Urquell didn't fold and the company stayed strong. So even as this style of beer was getting picked up by dozens and dozens, I mean really hundreds of competitors around the world, Pilsner Urquell continued to grow and by 1898 actually trademarked the name. Now after World War II ended, however, the citizens of the town, along with the citizens of Czechoslovakia, as the country was called at the time, along with, well, the citizens of Eastern Europe in general, found themselves on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And what this meant was that the brewery was nationalized, as was any private industry in a communist-run state. But once the Cold War ended and the Czech Republic was able to become an independent country, I mean, okay, technically it was like a Soviet puppet, it was nominally independent, but you know what I mean, the Czech Republic became actually independent in sort of the early 90s. Then the company, Pilsner Urquell, once again became a privatized organization, and then it went public very quickly after that because the beer was so popular. And through the 1990s and the early 2000s, it enjoyed a surge in popularity as it could be exported all around the world. And this helped not only reestablish Pilsner Urquell as an industry leader within the Czech Republic, it also, to a certain degree, helped the Czech Republic economically get back on its feet after the fall of communism. These days, Pilsner Urquell does still very good business. As of the early 2010s, the company produces around 8.3 million barrels of beer every year, US, which, even if those numbers are slightly old, is a lot of beer. Though as of 2017, the company is now a subsidiary of Asahi, which is a large Japanese brewing conglomerate. And actually, I talked very briefly about that in the Asahi video, or Kirin and Asahi video, I can put the link below, where Asahi, basically in the last kind of 15, 20 years, has been picking up a lot of different European breweries, especially continental European breweries, one of which is Pilsner Urquell. Rebel is arguably the best known brand of beer produced by the Havlíčkův brewery. And go easy on me, Czechs, I'm doing my best here. Now, the brewery is named after the town of Havlíčkův, which is located in basically the middle of the Czech Republic. It's like dead center in the country. And like with the town of Pilsen or Plzeňa, Havlíčkův, even back in the Middle Ages, had a population of both Germans and Czechs living within it. However, while the Germans actually were the ones who started beer in the town, they started in the 1300s with a license from the king, their numbers did dwindle over the course of the centuries. So by the time this brewery got started in the 19th century, it was much more of a sort of Czech enterprise. There was a lot less German influence involved in sort of operations getting started. Anyway, so what was happening from sort of the Middle Ages through the 19th century, 1800s, was that beer brewing in Europe, or life in general really you could say, was switching from that of sort of a cottage industry to that where a few but larger sort of companies made the products that sort of people consumed. And this was the case for brewing in the town of Havlíčkův. In the Middle Ages, there were tons of people making beer there. I mean, people in their backyard. A lot of it was not very good, supposedly. But by the late 1700s, early 1800s, the town was down to 2 breweries. But then one of those went bankrupt and the other one burned down, and that was almost back to back, leaving the citizens without any local beer producing facilities. So faced with disaster, the townsfolk decided to pool their money, and in 1834 they opened up the Havlíčkův Brod brewery. And to say that this brewery was a success is a bit of an understatement. Let's just say that throughout almost the rest of the 19th century, the brewery was perennially short of beer because people were consuming it so quickly. Demand consistently outstripped supply almost every single year, and eventually it was only in the 1880s that supply was able to actually catch up with demand when the brewers finally paid for an extension that allowed them to scale their operations. Now, after World War II, the brewery found itself on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain and thus was nationalized along with every other private enterprise in a now communist-run state. However, it was actually during this period of communist rule that Rebel, the brand of beer, actually got created. In 1964, the brewers of the Havlíčkův Brod brewery released a beer that they named in honor of Karel Havlíček Borovský, who is a 19th century Czech nationalist that, you know, he was sort of a politician, a writer, a publisher, a poet, you know, editor, you know, you get the idea. And the brewers sort of claimed that this guy was sort of a rebel, not just because he was, you know, from the local area, but because when Bohemia at the time was under Austrian rule, Borovský was a sort of, should we say, liberally minded but outspoken Czech nationalist. And it seems that he was a pretty enlightened and, you know, high-minded guy. He was advocating for things like universal suffrage in the 1840s, which, given the fact that basically nowhere on planet Earth had universal suffrage in the 1840s, let alone in many cases suffrage of any sort, that was a pretty radical concept. So anyway, once communism ended and the company was able to revert back to private ownership, the descendants of the original founders of the brewery were actually able to sort of take possession of their, shall we say, family business. And even to this day, Rebel is still a privately run brand of beer. These days, production is reasonably good, and operations are run by Pavel Pilař and Jana Borakova, who are sort of head and senior brewmasters respectively. And then, as of 2015, the company is now building out actually a small chain of restaurants, one of which is located in the town of Havlíčkův Brod. Now, I've never been to the Czech Republic, but I would love to go. I hear it is a beautiful, wonderful country. And aside from, of course, visiting Prague at some point, I gotta do that, I would love to stop in and visit the towns of Plzeň and Havlíčkův Brod. And maybe I can even have a beer while I'm there. So if you couldn't guess, today we will be trying Pilsner Urquell. The original Pilsner, what can I say? The recipe has remained unchanged since 1842. This beer is going to be crisp with some hoppy bitterness to it. Rebel Dark. This is a dark beer, or černý, meaning black in Czech, or Slavic languages in general. So as a darker beer, it's going to have sort of a sweeter and less bitter flavor profile. It's also the most awarded of the Rebel beers, having won a number of awards at sort of mid-level European-wide beer festivals. Rebel Original Premium. This is a classic Czech Pilsner. So per the style of lager, it's going to be very crisp and kind of hoppy.